technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View. And first of all, it is that Tuesday, which we've been talking about, Giving Tuesday today. And so we do, as we go through the program today, want to give you an update on how giving to Point of View has been coming. Last time I checked, we had more than $2,000 that was in towards our goal of $15,000 today. So if you have not given, there are some opportunities for you to do so by going to our website, pointofview.net, or perhaps you received an email that came out this morning to you, giving you a possibility of giving, and a place where we just remind you that your donation is going to be so significant in helping give truth to Americans. And we're going to be talking about a number of different aspects of that today, as you might imagine. A little bit later, we'll also be hearing from our Vice President for Stewardship, getting her comments. We certainly would love to hear from you as well. And most importantly, if you've been waiting to give, well, time has come, and we would certainly love to hear from you as well. Going to spend some time, first of all, talking about Love Justice International, an organization that's probably new to you, and that's why we are covering what they're doing. They've just hit a milestone of successfully intercepting 100,000 individuals, preventing them from being trafficked, and so we'll get into human trafficking and some of those issues. And then at the bottom of the hour, and then for quite a while, we're going to talk about the crisis in Venezuela. That will get us into what has been happening in Venezuela, why we have so many, at least as the country, so many military resources portrayed and actually deployed there in the Caribbean, what that might mean. What about the arguments about there being war crime being committed, which has been pretty much debunked by the New York Times? We'll get into that as well, and also just try to make some sense out of that, including just this whole issue of drone warfare and what that might mean. So there are a lot of different angles that will come out of that conversation, which will take place in about a half an hour or so. But let me bring to the microphone John Molineux, who is again an individual that graduated from Taylor University, then came to Nepal in 2002. 2 years later, returned there and inspired really his beginning of this organization, Love Justice International. Individual who is a writer, a thinker, a speaker, philosopher. And so, John, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Let's, if we can, maybe give people some background, because being in Nepal caused you to really think about this idea of bringing justice, and you have this phenomenal prevention system. But for our listeners, like myself, who are learning about this for the first time, can you give us some background?
Yeah, so I grew up in Helena, Montana. I was raised Catholic. When I was probably 15, I kind of reasoned that I was born in a Catholic or Christian household. Somebody else was born in a Muslim or Hindu household, so I have no more reason to just go on believing than they do, and sort of rejected it. But I still had a faith in God, and when I was 18, I went for a walk, and I told God, use my life however you want to. And a couple weeks later, a friend brought me to a youth group, and I felt like I heard the gospel for the first time, and I responded to an altar call, and that was the beginning of me giving my life to Christ. And so, as you mentioned, I would end up going to Taylor University, and after Taylor, would go to Nepal and would be involved in founding Love Justice International with the mission of sharing the love of Jesus Christ by fighting the world's greatest injustices. And early in my time in Nepal, I learned about human trafficking, and I learned that at that time, thousands of young Nepali women were deceived by false marriages and false jobs, and they were lured to India, where they would be abandoned in the red light districts and told that they had to do sex work until they had paid back the debt that the trafficker had paid to have them trafficked. And of course, these are innocent girls, and they tried to refuse, say, I want to go home, and they would be broken in by systematic, repeated assault in the worst ways imaginable.
Wow.
And when I learned about this, my heart was broken. I felt like we have to do something. We have to figure out how to fight this. And so started learning about different strategies that are used to fight human trafficking. You could divide the strategies into those that target the moment before and after a person is trafficked. The post-trafficking strategies like rescue and aftercare, it's tremendously important, incredible work, but it's hard. And the best aftercare in the world can't put back the pieces of what has been broken to an individual who has been trafficked. And of course, it would be far better, if possible, to prevent it from having happened in the first place. But the other prevention strategies that are used, like awareness and job creation, don't necessarily have a tangible impact where you can point to an individual and say, here's an individual who would otherwise have been trafficked, but for this intervention. And some research has suggested they may not actually reduce how much trafficking is happening. And so we discovered this model that was pioneered by several organizations in Nepal along the Nepal-India border in the early 2000s called transit monitoring. And it aims at that most strategic moment when a person is in the process of being trafficked, but before they've been exploited. And it is a uniquely effective model that has a tangible impact that prevents the enslavement of real individuals. And so it's an underfunded model. We feel it is the most effective way to fight human trafficking.
Well, again, your point's well taken. Better to prevent it than trying to eventually recover from it. And so this is a prevention system that monitors, as I understand, transit points. We're talking about bus stations, airports, a variety of other places. I shared the story recently, John, about an individual that was working at just the ticket counter at American Airlines, and two very enthusiastic young girls going to New York and thinking they're going to go modeling, and they're getting a one-way ticket. And that just, again, to her credit, raised a lot of red flags, and in that particular case, prevented what could have become a trafficking situation. And in some respects, it's just a good illustration that we should be not only supporting what you're doing because you've been so successful, but trying to get other organizations and other individuals to do that as well. And if you travel, oftentimes in these restrooms, you will see various signs that will say, if you're being trafficked, call this number or whatever. And there are all sorts of ways we can be helping. And so when I come back from the break, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how we can learn more about what you are doing. And if you go to the website right now, you will see that we have a link to lovejustice.ngo. And there is a way, if you wanted to make a gift or certainly find out more about what they're doing to keep people free from slavery and human trafficking, that is the case. If you'd like to know more about this organization and the model that they have so that you maybe could implement it in your area of influence, we certainly are encouraging you to do that. And then one of the things right next to the article about John is a piece that is their most recent press release, which is a very significant milestone of 100,000 intercepts that have taken place. So lots of great material there as we go to a break. And as we go to a break, don't forget, this is Giving Tuesday. We don't talk about finances too often, but this is one very good opportunity to encourage you. If you appreciate the kinds of conversations we have on this program every day, we'd love to hear from you. Again, you can give us a call. That order line number, 800-347-5151. Simply go to the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Michael Brown recently wrote about the truth about Christian Zionism. He wanted to answer two important questions. Is Christian Zionism an oxymoron? And is Christian Zionism a heresy? These questions have been around the church for some time, but they reached a critical level due to several Tucker Carlson interviews. In one, he challenged Senator Ted Cruz about his support for Israel. In another interview with Nick Fuentes, he complained that Christian Zionists have a brain virus and are promoting a Christian heresy. First, he dismissed the idea that Christian Zionism is an oxymoron. First, God's covenant with the patriarchs remains intact. Second, Jesus the Messiah did not cancel the promises to the patriarchs. Third, there are many Old Testament prophecies about the Jewish people regathering to the ancient homeland, and the Sinai covenant cannot annul the earlier promises to the patriarchs. He adds, that is why Jesus is returning to Jerusalem rather than to any other city, and it's also true that the Bible speaks of Jesus returning to a Jewish Jerusalem. He then answers the question whether Christian Zionism is a heresy. The previous comments should be sufficient to answer that, but he also responds to the argument that this idea only originated with the teachings of Darby in the 1830s. I've also seen videos of people arguing that it was promoted by the Schofield Bible or Speakers on Prophecy. His answer is to begin quoting from earlier church leaders and theologians while also providing quotes from Puritan and Anglican leaders in England. I recognize that some Christians may disagree with his comments, but I would also argue that you can't call Christian Zionism a heresy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing our conversation today with John Molineux, who is again with Love Justice International. And John, I thought it might be good for just a minute to give the full extent of what you're doing, because we've certainly talked about human trafficking, but as I understand, you also have children's home, family homes for orphaned and abandoned children. And what you've been doing in Nepal has expanded to many countries around the world, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. We started out. I started out working with street children, had my heart broken over their situation. We ended up starting several homes for orphaned and abandoned children, aimed to help them live flourishing, impactful lives for Christ. And then we discovered, we learned about human trafficking, discovered the transit monitoring model. And that's the part of our work, though, that is really scaled well around the world. Mm-hmm. Now we're in 17 countries. We have 57 stations, more than 150 monitors who work for us around the world, and are supported and overseen by over 300 volunteer subcommittee members. These are local Christians that sort of form a local board that oversee each of our stations.
So again, just an incredible outreach that you have. And I thought for just a few minutes we might talk about how people can help you. First of all, I would encourage people to think about going to Nepal. We've actually done interviews with individuals that have gone to Nepal, and in many cases they have come away saying, well, you talk about an unreached group of individuals and what a great need there. And then, of course, you've been able to meet not just the spiritual needs, but the physical needs and economic needs and the rest. So how can we help you? Because this is an organization that we're really trying to expose to our listeners for the first time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The first thing I would say is we would covet your prayers. We've seen significant breakthroughs happen in response to prayers, and I think sometimes our prayers do more than our boldest and most effective actions. And so please pray for our monitors around the world, that they would be discerning and led to the right people, that they would be bold and asking the right questions, that they would be protected, and that they would be able to get out in front of those people who, unless someone does get out in front of them, will be trafficked in the coming days and weeks. And pray for the church around the world, that the church would kind of rise up to Jesus' call for that whatever we do for the least of these, we do for him, and to build an impact all of those who are suffering around the world. But it is Giving Tuesday, as you said. It costs us just $112 to intercept one person to prevent them from being trafficked. And right now, till the end of the year, we have a $500,000 match campaign going on. So every gift you give has double the impact. So we rely on the support of individuals and primarily Christians to do this work. So we would also just appreciate spreading the word about human trafficking and the great injustice that it is, and Love Justice and transit monitoring as being a very effective way to fight it.
Might just mention, too, you have what's called Project Beautiful, where people can give a monthly gift. And, of course, you have all sorts of facts and figures and statistics and things of that nature. So I certainly would encourage people to pray about that. But, again, how can maybe we extend some of this? Because it does seem to me that this issue of human trafficking, I can remember, this goes now back at least 2 decades, the first time we really covered that on Point of View. There were people that were calling in when we open up the phones. We haven't opened up the phones yet, just saying, look, if this is as much of a problem as you say it is, I'd be hearing about this on the mainstream media. Fortunately, I had a member of Congress, or former member of Congress, who's one of the guests, so they couldn't completely say, I think this person is making it up, but that was sort of the implication. Well, we've gone from a time in which there was complete denial and lack of education to a time when I think we recognize this is a real issue. But it does seem to me, John, that you've come across a way in which to protect that in a way that would be much more significant. And so if people wanted to know just a little bit more about how you are able to interdict individuals, catch people before they are actually drawn into trafficking and slavery, they could actually contact you and find out a little bit more, couldn't they?
Yeah, for sure. We feel this strategy is again the most impactful way to fight human trafficking. It's something that we would love to see other organizations taking part in, and we've developed a strategy over a couple of decades that really works, and it's scalable, and again, it has a significant impact, and it's often it's understated, but it almost doesn't even need to be stated that impact is the main thing, should be the main thing in charitable work. You know, love cares about impact, because if it was you or me or our loved ones who are in a desperate situation, we wouldn't care about intentions or anything other than that the work effectively reached them. And so, again, we feel that transit monitoring has a unique impact in reducing and combating human trafficking.
One thing that's in your press release, and I encourage people to get it because it's the first article we've posted for you to read, is, again, you say, of the vast sums that are spent by NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and governments to fight human trafficking, only a small percentage goes towards tangibly preventing vulnerable women and children from enduring the horrors of slavery in the first place. And so it is much easier to build a guardrail on the top of the mountain rather than to have an ambulance or hospital at the bottom of the mountain. And the same kind of argument that you're making here, because this, first of all, catches the individual's trafficking, so you are putting people in jail, but also catching people before they're actually taken into this kind of sexual slavery. So I just thought that this was an organization people needed to know about. And if nothing else, this press release of 100,000 intercepts I thought was really encouraging. So, John, I appreciate you giving us some time today to talk about that, especially since it's Giving Tuesday, and maybe we can come back again and talk about some other things that you've been doing there at Love Justice International. For our listeners, let me just encourage you to go to the website. We have all the links necessary, and I would encourage you to contact him and find out a little bit more. So, John, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I do want to spend just a little bit of time getting into some other issues. But as we mentioned just a minute ago, it is Giving Tuesday, and in just a minute, I do want to connect up with our Vice President of Stewardship, because it does seem to me that as we are raising funds for this ministry, you can be a part of that. Today, our gift goal is $15,000, which is basically what it was last year, as I remember. And as I've heard, we are up to about 4,500. So we're doing quite well. And your gift will make a difference. And then, of course, we also would encourage you to consider what you might do by year end. But we are now joined by the Vice President of Stewardship for a Point of View, Jana Weidler. Jana, thank you for joining us again.
Well, hello, Kerby. It's good to be with you.
I think we're up to $4,500, and that's on the way to the $15,000. But we thought we'd have you on for just a minute, once again, to remind us of the fact that you are privileged to be able to call. We call them our partners, individuals that have actually partnered with us. And I hope that many of them that recognize your voice might either call in or click in and join us today during Giving Tuesday.
Well, I certainly hope so. That would be quite a blessing for us. I tell you, we just got a $500 gift from somebody who has been a partner of Point of Views for several years, giving a small monthly gift, which of course that adds up. But I believe that God put it on his heart that he has been blessed financially and wants to do the same thing for us. So his donation is not just an investment in Point of View. It also impacts God's kingdom. So we want you to have that same joy of giving that this gentleman had, and invest in Point of View.
I thought of something, and that is that when we first started this idea of Truth Team, $1 a day, $30 a month, that was like 2 decades ago. And of course, you've heard me on this program mention the fact that the value of the dollar has decreased rather dramatically. So some people might say, well, I've been giving to you monthly, and this Giving Tuesday doesn't have anything to do with me. But you might consider a one-time gift or even increasing your monthly gift, because after all, the dollars that we are receiving, which are about the same as we always have, don't go as far, because for some reason the electricity company charges us more, and the cost of all sorts of things for printing cost us more. And so there'd just be another opportunity for somebody to make that call at 800-347-5151 or visit the website at pointofview.net. What's your thoughts?
That you said it very well, Kerby. Every gift adds up and it makes a big impact. And if you just came off your Thanksgiving weekend, just thinking how blessed you are and how privileged you are to live in the United States, where we have so many things that are just so many running water, food on our table, roof over our heads, things that a lot of people around the world don't have. So if you feel that you truly are blessed, that God has blessed you, then please turn around and make that gift right now. If you're hearing my voice, please stop what you're doing and call in or go online.
Well, again, that number 800-347-5151. Of course, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. We have a lot more to cover. We'll get into that right after these important messages.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to talk about the crisis in Venezuela, and it's going to take a little while to kind of unpack each part of this story. First of all, it is, I think, helpful for those of you that are younger to realize that Venezuela was one of the more prosperous countries in South America. And I can say that with a couple of good reasons. Number one, years ago, I was fortunate enough to work with a secretary secretary in another ministry whose husband was actually involved in the oil companies in Venezuela. They were talking about the kind of money that was flowing out of those oil wells. Then I also remember my wife pointing out how some of these very wealthy young girls in Venezuela were going to other places, even the United States, to get all sorts of cosmetic surgery. And again, you only get cosmetic surgery if you have a real defect, but these were good-looking young ladies that wanted to look even better, and it just was an illustration that they had almost money to burn. Well, then you have the country taken over by Hugo Chavez, and if you want to understand what that looks like, I could hold up my booklet on a biblical view or Christian view of socialism, because that's one of the examples we use of how a country that was really awash in profits from the oil companies then Hugo Chavez decided to do a number of things, but essentially after kind of nationalizing the oil industry, essentially kicking all of these companies out, eventually this led to a tremendous amount of economic devastation. And then you have the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013, which is 12 years ago, almost 13 years ago. And he was replaced by Nicolas Maduro. You're going to hear that name a couple of times today. And from that point on, the problems that Hugo Chavez had got even worse. And so for the rest of that decade, whether it's 2014, 2015, 2016, all the rest, just an incredible economic collapse that took place. And then you had a movement even by, again, Nicolas Maduro to even become more authoritarian. And there was an attempt to actually eventually move him from power, which took place over a year ago. And the government, nevertheless, even though he lost, declared him the winner of an election, which I think almost everybody agrees was not accurate, was undemocratic. And even in previous years, you've had the International Criminal Court and others launching an investigation into all sorts of crimes against humanity, and there are many. You might say, well, what does this have to do with us? Well, first of all, it has created a refugee crisis. Almost 8 million people have left the country since May of this year, and you know where many of them showed up? In the United States. We've talked about this before. So it is sometimes tempting for us to just say, that's a Latin American country, I don't care, but they have in some respects exported their problems to this country. And of course, we'll get into some of that a little bit later when we talk about deportations and all the rest. Of course, you have poverty in that country. And so whether you're concerned about poverty in the Western Hemisphere in Haiti or in Venezuela is just as unbelievable. And of course, I've already alluded to the fact that there have been all sorts of human rights abuses. And that's really sort of a nice way to say it. So how can the Trump administration justify what it's doing? Well, my first article for you to read, and you're welcome to read each one of these because as best I will probably give you summaries of some of these, is one by Joshua Trevino and Melissa Ford. You might say, well, who are they? Well, they're actually part of the American First Policy Institute. And so in some respects, they're going to represent why Donald Trump is doing what he's going to do. And they said, at this writing, the United States appears to be on the verge of military action against the Venezuelan regime. The President of the United States has de facto closed Venezuelan airspace, which gets us to our first of many issues. There have been many of the opponents of Donald Trump saying he does not have the authority to do so, but nevertheless, he has done that nevertheless. And the highest concentration of American military power in the SOUTHCOM area of responsibility since 1989 is in the Caribbean Basin. And so you have, everything from naval assets to Air Force and all sorts of things there. We'll get into some of the details about that in just a minute. So these authors say anyone outside of the administration who offers definitive answers about why this is happening is either, they said, misleading at worst or incompetent at best. The decision makers know their full rationales and will share them when they wish. For now, even the legal memorandum justifying the strikes on maritime traffickers remains undisclosed. So recognize everything you're going to hear over the next half an hour, maybe hour, we'll see how long some of this goes, is to be taken with a grain of salt or maybe a whole bag of salt. But nevertheless, the authors go on to say it is a truism that policy emerges not necessarily when one overriding interest compels, although they then quote from Federalist Paper number 70, when multiple interests overlap and amplify one another. In other words, don't see this as a mutually exclusive phenomenon. On the one hand, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, you have the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, talking about this as primarily to interdict drugs. Well, you don't need the largest aircraft carrier in the world, at least in the United States, there in the Caribbean to do that. Okay, so there are some other things going on, and so we'll get into those in just a minute. But the point is that there may be multiple reasons for the actions being taken by the Trump administration, and they go on to say Venezuela and its regime find themselves in the intersection of administration priorities. Among them are the reassertion of American primacy in the Western Hemisphere. Number two, the security of the Panama Canal. See, that's another issue we haven't raised yet. And I'm going to try to bring in all these pieces that, unfortunately, the legacy media, sometimes even the so-called alternative media, don't cover. And then a revived, if you will, Monroe Doctrine, including what's called the Roosevelt Corollary. And then, of course, the suppression of human trafficking, the whole issue of migration, the dismantling of a narco-state archipelago across the Americas, and the demonstration of American military credibility after the decline under the previous administration. There, as you can see, are a lot of reasons why we have military assets right now in the Caribbean. Okay, let's continue on. For those of us within the Latin American security and policy space, and these individuals are, Venezuela's regime is the archetype of a cartel state synthesis, what's called un estado de narco, in which state and criminal activity exist in cooperation, integration, and mutual reinforcement. You might say, well, yeah, but that's sort of what we also have in Mexico. Very true, not denying that, but there is at least an attempt to have some kind of relationship between the United States and Mexico, which then in some cases can be used to break up the state cartel synthesis that has existed there. Nothing of the sort, of course, exists with Venezuela. So they go on to say that Venezuela, with its visible integration of cartel and state activities with Cartel de Solas and others, differs from Mexico, and its regime offers no gestures of cooperation with the United States against its cartel partners whatsoever. So I've made that case. You may wonder, a minute ago I talked about the Monroe Doctrine. Well, the Monroe Doctrine goes all the way back to James Monroe, and again, it is the argument that we want to protect the Western Hemisphere, and there's another factor which is almost never mentioned by the legacy media or the mainstream press, and that is Venezuela hosts a remarkable array, they say, of extra hemispheric actors and their proxies, including Russia, China, and even Iranian states, which the United States has an interest in seeing curbed or expelled. So again, you might say some of that might exist in Mexico, but nothing like it exists there in Venezuela. And of course, there's been real concerns about the connection of China to the Panama Canal. So all of these pieces go together in a way that I think are very significant. I have a lot more to say, but I do need to come to a break, but it's just an attempt to try to help you understand there's a lot more at stake here. And maybe that helps us understand a little bit more why all of a sudden we seem like we are looking for what could be regime change in Venezuela, and the reason and the justification for why some of these various assets have been deployed to the Caribbean. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we can get into this whole issue of what is happening in Venezuela. And already I probably have covered this in more detail than you've heard anywhere else. And the reaction sometimes is interesting. Some people say, you went into so much detail, you kind of lost me. Or sometimes people say, I am so grateful for Point of View because nobody takes the time to put all the pieces together and recognize I've already helped you understand the strategic significance of what has happened in Venezuela, the migrants that have come to this country, the whole issue of drug trafficking and human trafficking, haven't even got into the issue of drones. You might remember a while back we had a friend of Steve Miller's, Mike Madden, who actually wrote the book Drone, part of the Tom Clancy series, because he'd done a 4-book series before that. We haven't even got into some of those aspects, nor have we even begun to touch on whether or not what happened this last week was a war crime, and we'll probably postpone some of the issues about Pete Hegseth and that into the next segment. But this is the kind of in-depth coverage we think is necessary, and I oftentimes find myself very disturbed by the fact that you don't have mainstream journalists going into some of the depth necessary to understand why something takes place. And you're going to see that as we go on, I'm going to quote from the New York Times and also from, of course, this one article, I think this was a National Review, and a couple of others. So you're going to get a spectrum of ideas and values. And if nothing else, in just a minute when we talk once again about Giving Tuesday, I hope that might be another reason for you to consider supporting this ministry. But let me finish off this first article, which I would encourage you to read, because they're pointing out that, first of all, we have the Monroe Doctrine. And do we really want to have Russia and China and Iranian assets and other Islamic groups in Venezuela causing problems? And I think the answer is no. So that certainly fits into the issue of the Monroe Doctrine. Certainly when we talk about the cartels and the drug trafficking, that is the case. But there's one more that they talk about, and that is, they said, when considering the crisis of mass migration, which Americans have seen visible in their own communities, it is impossible to ignore Venezuela as one of the hypocenters. The Venezuelan regime, through a combination of repression and incompetence, has overseen the exile of nearly a quarter of its entire population, a collapse that typically requires a major war to achieve. Those individuals have shown up, and you've heard us talk about Venezuelan gangs and various apartment complexes in places like Colorado and all sorts of other things. And so that is the key issue. Well, they go on to say that in securing Americans' interests at strategic points, including the American-conceived and created Panama Canal, we should note that the deployment of forces and the creation of these facilities across this military outreach has already de facto achieved the strategic equivalent of the return of American forces into the old canal zone, something we have not seen in a long time. Finally, they say, the mere presence of American forces are now achieved and have now achieved and reestablished a regional status quo that used to exist up until about 1990, when the United States had a permanent presence across the Caribbean basin and act as an individual to secure all the rights of individuals there. They go on to say one other thing. The other thing is it shows Americans that it is willing, that is, the United States is willing to put the armed forces of the United States in line in their direct interest. Venezuela and the Western Hemisphere are, after all, literally dinner table issues for ordinary Americans. They're saying, now that's not to say that the nature of this regime is something that was discussed over Thanksgiving leftovers anywhere except maybe in Washington, D.C. or Georgetown. But it is important to understand that Americans have lived through the crises created and amplified by that regime. Again, recognize how some of these communities were changed by Venezuelan gangs and other things and have had to endure harm because of the mass migration it spurs. So this is an attempt to try to at least give some justification for why Donald Trump is doing what he is doing. We're going to take a break in just a minute. When we come back, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what the editors of the National Review are saying in terms of what should be the next step. And they're saying that it would be very important for the president and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, to go to Congress and get confirmation for this and approval. We'll also get into the issue of Pete Hegseth and the boat strike and the charges, which I think now have been pretty much dismissed by the New York Times, criticizing the Washington Post. You know you have a problem when the New York Times is criticizing the Washington Post for a false article, but we'll get into that in the next hour. But I just thought before we come to the top of the hour, it would be great to once again hear from Vice President of Stewardship, Jana Weidler. And Jana, how are we doing?
Oh, we're doing pretty well, Kerby. We want to let people know that every single gift counts. We really need you to help us make our goal because, helping to continue our mission, your generosity fuels our work. We cannot do what we do without you. So as our partners and teammates, I just want to remind you guys that we have a very small staff. We only have 11 people on our staff, and we're able to do a lot with that small staff, but we need you. Every gift will make a huge impact. So please give now.
I might just mention, too, that if you're a monthly giver and you're watching online, I'll hold up the December issue of Outlook, and that one is Rumblings of Revival. So, again, some of you may just say, look, I can only give a one-time gift. Well, we are grateful for that gift, whatever size it might be. Some of you might think about giving on a monthly basis because any monthly gift receives this. Of course, we've also talked about the benefit of giving $1 a day, $30 a month so that you receive the booklets as well. And I'm holding up one that we haven't even mailed out yet, but I pulled it out of the box here. It's the one for January on Generation AI. And so these, I think, Jana, are examples of the kinds of topics we address. Maybe occasionally in a church you'll hear a pastor talk about we might be on the edge of revival, but I'm pretty sure that nobody's ever heard a sermon on artificial intelligence, yet that's going to affect our culture and our lives just as well. And so we try to cover issues that certainly are important to Christians, whether they're covered in the church or not. We try to give you some news, information, and commentary that I hope would certainly be worth your financial support.
That's right, Kerby. Your gifts will make an eternal difference. I just want to state that your gift is going to change a life. You just don't know it yet. But these booklets and these magazines are left in dental offices and offices all across the United States, and somebody's going to pick that up and read it, and it's going to change their life. And you can be a part of that by giving today, this Giving Tuesday. Please bless us with the best gift you can.
Let me also encourage you to do so because we want to give to you. One of the things you, Jana, talk about so often is we see these individuals as partners, and we're not asking you to give so that we can minister to someone else. We want to minister to other people, but we also want to give you all the information necessary so that you can make an impact in your sphere of influence. So that's just another benefit of supporting Point of View, isn't it?
That's true, Kerby. These booklets especially are so helpful for people that, it just takes about 10 minutes to read it. And it covers all sorts of topics that a lot of people are not comfortable speaking about because they don't feel that they're informed. Well, we can help you be informed, but we need your help. We need your gifts.
Well, again, we're coming to a break, so this would be a perfect time to make a phone call. 800-347-5151. If you go to the website, pop up Giving Tuesday. You can click on that button. We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-347-5151. I'll give you an update on the top of the hour. We'll be right back.
The headlines are saying that Gen Z is leading church attendance. How exciting to see that young adults are seeking truth. Of course, there are a lot of lies competing for their attention and their hearts. The good news is you can give Americans the gift of truth. Today is Giving Tuesday, the perfect opportunity to make an intentional impact through your generosity. Every day, Point of View brings biblical truth to people across the nation and around the world. But as a listener-supported ministry, we rely on the generosity of people like you. Will you partner with Point of View here on Giving Tuesday and give the gift of truth to a seeking nation? Visit us online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Today's the day, Giving Tuesday, pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to continue our conversation about the crisis with Venezuela. Then we'll move on to some other issues. As a matter of fact, one of those has to do with another issue, and that is, what about certain people that have emigrated to this country from Afghanistan, and that has become front and center because of the killing of a National Guard, and we'll get into some of that, and we'll also probably pick up some of that tomorrow. A very good piece that I have posted by Cal Thomas about that. But let's, if we can, continue on, because one of the other articles here reminds us that the regime of the president right now of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, is malign and illegitimate. He stole the 2018 presidential election. Nearly 60 countries, they point out, joined the United States in recognizing his opponent as the rightful president of that country. 6 years later, opposition leader defeated him in the ballot box, but again, he refused to accept the results. So we've had two different elections where he shouldn't even be sitting in that position, and nevertheless, that shows you his authoritarian regime and what is happening there. So the editors of the National Review also go on to say that Nicolas Maduro and his henchmen have systematically stolen the wealth of his country and immiserated its people. But the regime is not merely a domestic problem for people in Venezuela, because it has directly and consistently threatened American interest. I mentioned some of those last hour from this piece by Joshua Trevino and Melissa Ford. He goes on to say, for years, the regime has facilitated and profited from the trafficking of drugs at an industrial scale into the United States. Indeed, in 2020, Maduro was indicted by U.S. federal prosecutors for his association with the Cartel de las Soles, of the Cartel of the Sums, which we mentioned just a few minutes ago as well. And he has also aligned with a veritable who's who of anti-American despots. That would be Cuba, which I didn't mention a minute ago, Iran, and of course I mentioned Russia and China. And he has brought into the Western Hemisphere their financial interests, their intelligence apparatuses, and even the possibility of the projection of their military power against us, a direct challenge to the long-standing U.S. policy, which is, again, as we mentioned, the Monroe Doctrine, towards and against old world intervention into the New World. So the end of the Nicolas Maduro regime and its replacement by a democratically elected alternative would be an unambiguous boon and benefit, of course, to the United States. While the Trump administration's current anti-Maduro policy is highly threatening to the regime, at the same time, they point out it's vague and contradictory. And I've already alluded to that, but let's get into that. Secretary of State, they say Marco Rubio has called the administration's actions a counter-drug operation. Very true. But the New York Times reported in mid-November that Marco Rubio told House and Senate leaders that ousting Mr. Maduro was not the administration's objective. Well, first of all, that might have been the more classic and politically correct thing to say in November, but doesn't necessarily mean some things aren't happening behind the scenes. But I'll leave it at that. Nevertheless, as they point out, the United States has assembled a powerful naval fleet to include a carrier strike group and a Marine expeditionary unit in the Caribbean. The Air Force has deployed fighter squadrons to the region. We are attacking and destroying suspected drug smuggling boats on the high sea, and the President of the United States declared on social media that the airspace over Venezuela is closed, a move that has been traditionally understood as an act of war and one that can only be enforced by U.S. military power. So that's kind of the circumstance we find ourselves in. We'll spend some time talking about these drone strikes, but again, some of the complaint about the drone strikes I find kind of interesting given the fact that there were drone strikes under George W. Bush. There were significant drone strikes by Barack Obama, and hardly a peep from any of the Democrats, although to be fair, there was at least one kind of leftist organization that was primarily a human rights group that after a while actually referred to Barack Obama as the deporter-in-chief and the drone striker-in-chief. So, I mean, obviously they had, in some respects, some concerns. But nevertheless, drone strikes have been allowed, even in the first administration of Donald Trump. Remember, he took out Jaime Soleimani and some others. So anyway, that is, I think, an illustration of where we are. But now here's the bottom line, which comes from the editors of National Review. All of these moves indicate the United States is strongly contemplating regime change, not merely involved in a counter-drug campaign. But, they said, if President Trump intends to use military force to topple Maduro or coerce him into exile, he should go to Congress to ask for an authorization for the use of military force. And that is something we have said on this program since the days in which we have even had the first Bush presidency and the second Bush presidency arguing that those are justified under maybe the War Powers Act or the use of military force. We have in the Constitution the idea of declaring war. We haven't really done that effectively in decades. I understand that, but it does seem to me that, as they say, President Trump should do this not only because such an request would place the decision to declare war in both the spirit and the letter of our Constitution where it belongs, Congress, but because his administration has made no sustained effort to explain to the American people why Venezuela's current government warrants removal at the cost of American treasure and very possibly American lives. I would venture to say that you've heard me say just in this last couple of segments more about Venezuela than you've heard from the mainstream press, even more than you've heard from this administration, and I think it illustrates exactly why we need to address that issue. And they go on to say that the decades since 9/11 have taught us anything, it should be that seeking congressional authorization is not just the right thing, but the wise thing. So another one of those articles that you are welcome to read. When we come back, we're going to get into this. The New York Times reported that lawmakers suggest that this follow-up boat strike could be a war crime. Then we get into a piece by Andrew McCarthy about that, and then a response from Kurt Schlichter. So everything from a town hall column to New York Times piece, and that will get us into the issue of drone strikes. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we had in the past Mike Madden on the program. And indeed, he spent some time talking about his drone novel that's part of the Tom Clancy series, and even before that did a 4-part series on drones. So this whole issue of drone strikes, we're going to get into what are the issues related to war, international policy, and the rest. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll also maybe tap into the president of Point of View, Warren Kelly, get some of his thoughts about this Giving Tuesday. But as we go to a break, another great opportunity for you to go to the website, pointofview.net, and to help us reach our goal today of $15,000 on Giving Tuesday. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Michael Brown recently wrote about the truth about Christian Zionism. He wanted to answer 2 important questions. Is Christian Zionism an oxymoron, and is Christian Zionism a heresy? These questions have been around the church for some time, but they reached a critical level due to several Tucker Carlson interviews. In one, he challenged Senator Ted Cruz about his support for Israel. In another interview with Nick Fuentes, he complained that Christian Zionists have a brain virus and are promoting a Christian heresy. First, he dismissed the idea that Christian Zionism is an oxymoron. First, God's covenant with the patriarchs remains intact. Second, Jesus the Messiah did not cancel the promises to the patriarchs. Third, there are many Old Testament prophecies about the Jewish people regathering to the ancient homeland, and the Sinai covenant cannot annul the earlier promises to the patriarchs. He adds that is why Jesus is returning to Jerusalem rather than to any other city, and it's also true that the Bible speaks of Jesus returning to a Jewish Jerusalem. He then answers the question whether Christian Zionism is a heresy. The previous comments should be sufficient to answer that, but he also responds to the argument that this idea only originated with the teachings of Darby in the 1830s. I've also seen videos of people arguing that it was promoted by the Schofield Bible or Speakers on Prophecy. His answer is to begin quoting from earlier church leaders and theologians while also providing quotes from Puritan and Anglican leaders in England. I recognize that some Christians may disagree with his comments, but I would also argue that you can't call Christian Zionism a heresy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we can go to the New York Times. Michael Gold, reporting in Washington, said that there was a top Republican and Democrats in Congress suggesting this on Sunday that American military officials might have committed a war crime in President Trump's offense against boats in the Caribbean after a news report said that during one such attack, a follow-up strike was ordered to kill survivors. Now, that story came from the Washington Post. In just a minute, I'm going to tell you, I guess I can actually, spoiler alert, tell you that the New York Times report since then is really questioned, and I think pointed out that that was probably a good example of fake news. But nevertheless, let's get into it because it led to some very significant soul searching, and it is an example of how one story, which may or may not have been true, I have my doubts about it now, started a whole series of conversations, one of which was on Face the Nation, where you had Representative Mike Turner, a Republican from the state of Ohio, said that obviously if that occurred, and I appreciate the disclaimer, that would be very serious, and I agree that that would be an illegal act. Then you had also on CNN and CBS and a couple of others the same thing. For example, Tim Kaine said that if the report was accurate, that level rises to the level of a war crime. And on CNN, when asked if he believed the second strike to kill survivors constitute a war crime, Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat from Arizona, said the same. So you have, of course, people wanting to investigate this, and I think that is appropriate. I think it is time probably to get Pete Hegseth back to Congress, put up his right hand, swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, the whole truth, and everything about that. But I think we already know that the story was reckless and was not accurate. But nevertheless, Senators Roger Wicker, who is a Republican from Mississippi, and chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Jack Reed, who is a Democrat from Rhode Island, said that they were going to have directed inquiries to the Defense Department and provide some oversight. But nevertheless, the issue has been the fact that we've had these drone strikes. Now, again, I would agree with some of the comments that were made by Rand Paul when these drone strikes were being used both by President Bush and by President Obama. You're, in a sense, taking out people with the risk that in some respects you're taking out people who are innocent, and you may also be taking out people who were collateral damage. And there were quite a few under that, which we'll get into a little bit later. But nevertheless, we have about, the best estimates are about 80 people that have been killed as a result of these drone strikes, which leads me to another piece. And this one comes from Andrew McCarthy, who simply points out that the administration, and in particular the White House, was at first just simply saying we've had effective drone strikes and left it at that, went back to try to explain a little bit more, which we now know was false, and that is the story that came from the Washington Post, which if tonight you're watching the news and people are still citing the Washington Post piece, that should tell you everything about the inaccuracy of some of the press. Because interestingly enough, you have the New York Times on Monday publishing a detailed report that directly undercut the original Washington Post story. They cited 5 U.S. officials familiar with the operation, and the New York Times reported that Pete Hegseth's actual guidance was limited to pre-strike authorization for a lethal kinetic operation. And so in some respects, as some people have said, what began as a blockbuster accusation has quickly become the latest example, again, of inflammatory narrative that really didn't survive any kind of follow-up scrutiny. And so again, the piece I give you by Andrew McCarthy is where he maintains that these killings, the 80 individuals have been killed, are not within the kind of understanding of international law, because we are not dealing with an actual force that has come against us. Unless he says there's an armed conflict, the operators of the boats cannot be considered, he says, enemy combatants. Even if they are criminals, the laws of war allow our armed forces to target enemy combatants, not mere criminals. So I've given you a range of perspectives, but before we get kind of an update on where we are on Giving Tuesday, I thought I would also point to a piece by Kurt Schlichter in which he points out that here you've got to at least pay attention to the interesting timing, because you've had all sorts of claims being made by a number of prominent Democrats that you are supposed to actually disobey illegal orders. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, now you have Democrats arguing that we have an illegal order. And that is the argument that Pete Hegseth is killing innocent drug dealers. Well, that's not necessarily what they're saying, but essentially they are. And he says you would know that if you hadn't seen a coordinated action from the media and the Democratic narrative that indeed the Washington Post story is true, which of course now we know it's not. And so overnight, the Democrats and all the regime media, he says, were exactly on the same page. I wonder how that happened, he said. You may or may not have noticed in the last couple of weeks that suddenly out of nowhere, for no reason, you had a bunch of Democrats announcing that troops are not supposed to follow illegal orders, which is something all soldiers are trained for, and it's not a shock or surprise or revelation to anyone. Of course, this is all leading up to this fake revelation, this bogus piece on Pete Hegseth that couldn't be less convincing if 51 renowned intelligence officers signed onto it like they did onto the Hunter Biden laptop being a Russian fake. Well, he goes on to, again, remind us that this is not necessarily going to play very well except inside your bubble. There are a lot of people that are in mainstream America that are simply saying, you know, we've lost over 100,000 American lives to drugs in recent years. So destroying a drug boat, even if some individuals survived and were taken out again, and that's up for some debate, interestingly enough, they're not going to feel too unhappy about that. And I think it's just an illustration, again, that some of the arguments being made right now just simply coincide so well with some of the things being said over the last couple of weeks. And if you don't see that as anything other than just a remarkable coincidence, well, I probably can't help you. But just before we take a break, I thought we'd get an update on where we are. And so I thought we would bring in the president of Point of View, Warren Kelly. And so, Warren, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for allowing me to sit in with you, Kerby.
So where are we at this point? Because our goal is $15,000, and we're going to have about a half an hour left to actually reach that goal.
Yes, you mentioned at the beginning of the show that we were about $4,500, and that was a good place for us to be at the beginning of the show. But now we're about three-quarters of the way through the show, and we still haven't gotten to $5,000 yet. So we really do need to hear from several people in the audience as soon as you can.
Well, again, I think it might be helpful to point out that when they're supporting this ministry, of course, we're helping them have a ministry, but we're also helping, and they are helping us reach others. So their gift really just bypasses Point of View and goes to the individuals that are hearing these particular presentations, the news, commentary, information, even the outreach. And so in some respects, their gift can have a very significant impact, can't it?
I know very few organizations that have had the level of impact on our culture that Point of View has had. And I know we've had numbers of prominent guests that have said basically the same thing. There are so many lives that have been changed by the program, and those lives have gone on to do other things that have impacted the culture in a powerful way that wouldn't have happened without Point of View. So your gift really will make a difference in our culture. If you're concerned about the future of our nation, if you're concerned about what we're going to leave behind to our children and grandchildren, we really do need to hear from you today.
Well, again, we're coming to a break, so let me just mention a couple of things. If you go to the website at pointofview.net, the banner right there says Giving Tuesday is today, and you can click on the button that says Give Now. And I suspect some of you would like to give a one-time gift, but I also want to challenge some of you that there's a single gift function and an ongoing one. And as we mentioned just a minute ago, some of the benefits that come from your monthly gift, first of all, it's beneficial to us, but it's beneficial to you as well, because as I just hold up again, the most recent December issue of Outlook, and these are the kinds of resources we're going to put in your hands. If you join at the larger level, as we mentioned, you receive those booklets. So certainly you can go to the website, pointofview.net. But let me, as we go to a break, also give that phone number. It is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. You can talk to a staff person of Point of View. Please give that call. We'll be right back.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, and let me just mention tomorrow we're going to also get into this issue of the idea of whether or not we should limit how we bring people into this country, because my last article is by Kevin McCullough, who's been on the program with us before, also a talk show host, saying rethinking a Muslim ban. And we'll get into that again tomorrow because Cal Thomas has a very good piece, which I've already requested being posted on a permanent pause. So this is not just a one-time comment. It's one that we're going to have to think through as well. Just as we were expressing some concern about individuals that have come to this country from Venezuela who actually in some respects mean us harm, or in some respects do not necessarily fit the criteria that has been given. One criterion that was given by President Trump is that anybody who comes to this country should love America. Well, yeah, makes some sense to me, and yet it's amazing how many people we bring into this country who it's pretty obvious don't like this country, but come here for all sorts of other reasons. So Kevin McCullough says, first of all, the so-called Muslim ban was never really a ban. It was a phrase, as he says, that critics shouted loudly and often enough because people hadn't really learned what the actual policy was. But I think the reason more and more people, whether it's Kevin McCullough in our piece today, Cal Thomas in our piece tomorrow, are bringing this up is because of what has happened. The killing of an innocent National Guard is, I think, and of course, another one really on the edge of life. These are individuals who did not need to be attacked, much less killed. And it is, I think, a reminder of the fact that we have some individuals, not all, but some individuals that are like a ticking time bomb. And that is something to talk about. So again, Kevin McCullough says the political and media elite erupted again this week when President Trump stated that if reelected, he would absolutely revoke citizenship from naturalized criminals and take strong measures to protect Americans from violent offenders who entered under our increasingly broken immigration system. And so this caused a lot of people to begin to talk about the so-called Muslim ban, which is not what it was. It was an attempt to actually focus on any individual who is a refugee from 7 countries that were racked by civil war or controlled by terror networks or lacked some kind of reliable identification verification system. Those would either not be allowed or would undergo extensive scrutiny, not because they were Muslim necessarily, but because they came from dangerous areas, and that would be Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. Now, when I say Somalia, those of you that live in Minnesota know what I'm talking about right now. That's been the latest controversy. We haven't even had a chance to get to that. But nevertheless, as Kevin McCullough points out, this week's headlines provide fresh And he says horrifying evidence that the threat is not theoretical. After the killing of an innocent New York Guard troop and a critical wounding of another by a shooter reportedly here illegally from Afghanistan, a country that President Biden handed back to the Taliban in historic failure, Americans are once again confronted with the consequences of importing instability and hoping for the best. And he gives us some reminders of the fact that even though this individual probably is one that should have been evaluated along the way, we are talking about a Muslim religion where not everyone indeed is dangerous, but some are. And I think it is unfortunate sometimes to paint with too broad a brush. But it's also unfortunate the mainstream media wants to turn, if I can change the metaphor, a blind eye to what it's like to have come from a Muslim country where some of these actions are typical. And Kevin McCullough uses one example that comes from the Netherlands, and that is a Muslim father and his two sons in the Netherlands have been charged with drowning their 18-year-old daughter, or in this case, sister, because what? She adopted what they called a Western lifestyle and refused to wear a headscarf. And so we are seeing these kinds of, if you will, honor killings taking place. Just north of where I'm broadcasting right now, we had an honor killing from a Muslim father. And as he points out, what we're dealing with in many of these Muslim countries, and here's the long list: honor killings, forced circumcision of girls, female genital mutilation across large portions of North Africa, wife beating legalized or tacitly protected in parts of the Middle East, public executions for leaving Islam, children forced into child marriage, women treated not as human beings but as property whose value is based on obedience. And he points out these are not fringe anomalies. These are what in many cases are seen as cultural norms in large swaths of the Muslim world. Now, he brings us back to some kind of common sense. That American principle, the belief that every individual is created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, is the foundation for the concept of human rights. Remove that principle, he says, and freedom collapse into barbarism, a culture that treats women like disposable furniture and kills its daughters for autonomy cannot peacefully integrate into a society that believes human beings possess sacred dignity. He says this is not an abstract concern. It is personal. On Sunday over brunch, I tried to explain these realities to my sons. It was painful because we personally know Muslims whom we count as friends, moderate, thoughtful, and kind people who enjoy the liberty that America provides, people who do not practice these extreme devotions of fundamentalist Islamic law. But as I would point out, my wife and I have developed some great friendships, especially with this one Muslim couple. Have come here from other countries. She wears her headscarf, but he works in a hospital. They are delightful individuals, and so we recognize that we don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. But at the same time, we don't want to ignore the fact that we do need to paint with some kind of brush because this is dangerous. So he says it's not racist to ask whether importing large populations from cultures that endorse or tolerate honor killings, female mutilation, or religiously justified violence is wise. It is not hateful to protect our daughters from being murdered in this name of purity. It's not bigotry to insist that those entering our nation embrace the belief that women and children have intrinsic value. But he says thanks to previous administrations, and he mentions Barack Obama and Joe Biden, refugee and asylum pipelines from volatile regions expanded dramatically, often over the objections of national security officials. Now, after preventable deaths, President Trump faces an impossible moral math. Act boldly and be called cruel, or do nothing and allow the killing to continue. There is only one morally defensible path. Revoking citizenship from naturalized criminals is not extreme. Halting asylum fraud is not extreme. Restoring travel restrictions from radicalized nations is not extreme. Speedy deportations of violent offenders is not extreme. Protecting innocent American lives is not cruelty. It is leadership. The hardest policy is the one that allows more people to die. The left insists strong borders are unkind. No burying a soldier while explaining that we refuse to act is unkind. Telling parents their daughters died because we chose ideology over safety is unkind. Watching terrorists exploit compassion and slaughter our citizens is unkind. He concludes by saying America must choose civilization or chaos, security or suicide, courage or appeasement. We cannot survive a world where every value is negotiable and every boundary is erased. We have a duty to protect the civilization our ancestors built with blood and hard-won wisdom. So again, it's a piece by Kevin McCullough. He is a talk show host, an individual who's been on the program, and a reminder of the fact that we may be in for quite a debate, but rather than call it a Muslim ban, let's call it what it is, a restriction on individuals coming from countries where the norm is something which is antithetical to our biblical principles about human rights. And that makes sense. And unfortunately, common sense is a hard commodity sometimes to find, even in Washington, D.C., but it's certainly one that we need to talk about. And we will talk about it again tomorrow because the piece by Cal Thomas gives us some other facts and figures and information we need to know about as well. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. One of the questions I want to ask is, are we on the edge of a revival? After hearing all the things that we've talked about over the last hour, you're probably ready for some kind of spiritual awakening to take place. And again, I will hold up the December issue of Outlook. One of the reasons is because that is the topic. And I might just mention that we have a section where I've talked about some of the campus revivals taking place. Then I have a whole teaching on the history of revivals, which I'll come back to in just a minute. Then a very good piece by our friend John Stonestreet, who is with the Colson Center, Is This Revival? And talks about that memorial service for Charlie Kirk and some of the various events that have been taking place, which we are certainly encouraged by. And then finally, a piece by Liberty McCarter, Our Turning Point on Charlie Kirk Revival and Spiritually Hungry Generations. So it, first of all, is one of the benefits that you receive if you give to Point of View on a monthly basis. Some of you that are already receiving it probably have been reading through it and appreciate that. But again, I want to maybe call out to some of you. We recognize that only about 1% of all our listeners ever give to this ministry. And so if you're one of that 99%, this is one of the benefits that simply comes from supporting this ministry on a monthly basis. And of course, we've mentioned the booklets and others that are at a higher giving level. But if you go to the website, pointofview.net, you'll find out about it. But if nothing else, we certainly wanted to not only highlight the issue of revival, but one of the other benefits that comes from simply being associated with Point of View is my daily commentary. My commentary today is the whole question about Christian Zionism, but I thought in the spirit of talking about revival, last Friday, my commentary was on revival. And since I was not there, since we played a tape, I thought I would come back to it because it was certainly mentioning the fact that we do indeed have some evidence of a spiritual awakening taking place in this country. But the commentary was about an interview I did with Dr. Doug Groothuis, who has been on the program really since the 1980s with us. And he was teaching a course at Cornerstone Seminary when a student asked him about the role of apologetics and revival. Well, he said, that's a good idea. Maybe I should write an essay on it. And so this commentary is not only about that article, but also has a link to his article that was in the Worldview Bulletin. And we thought it fit very well with our December issue. But he points out that we certainly need to think about how revival could break out, because some of the key verses, if you want to write some of those down, Hosea 4:6, for example, Hosea 4:6, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Proverbs 29:18 warns, where there is no revelation, people cast off restraint. So Hosea 4:6 and Proverbs 29:18. But in the New Testament, a passage I used yesterday, we talked about Colossians 2:8. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elementary spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ. And it does seem to me that the argument that Doug Groteis was making is, if we have revival, we're going to need good theology. We're going to have apologetics. Apologetics, as he defined, is an attempt to show that Christianity is objectively true, compellingly rational, and pertinent to the whole of life. First of all, we're going to need that because as a revival might break out, the people watching it may not really understand what's going on. They may be very fearful of what that might bring about. And so in some respects, we need to defend what Christianity is all about. And certainly there are many people that actually have a great deal of fear about Christianity right there. He also acknowledged that in some respects, we should find support in some non-Christian philosophies, ideologies, and theologies because of common grace, because all truth is God's truth. And a good example of that we can find in Acts 17. There's where Paul is preaching to the philosophers in Athens. Now, they didn't have the Bible. They had not read the Old Testament. They did not know about the coming Messiah. They didn't even believe in one true God. They believed in many gods. So Paul takes some quotes from some of their philosophers and uses that to then unfold the biblical revelation. And it's been my argument that I think whether we experience a revival or not, we will certainly need very sound theology, very sound apologetics to be able to defend a Christian view. And in my piece where I talk about these revivals, we had a first Great Awakening. We then had a second Great Awakening that was in the 19th century. We had the Layman's Prayer Revival in 1857 in New York City. We had a Civil War revival. We had all sorts of revivals that took place because of people like D.L. Moody. You have the Welsh revivals. You have the Azusa Street revival. You have all sorts of parachurch ministries after World War II that break out. Of course, we have everything from the charismatic movement and Calvary Chapel and things that we actually read about or even saw on movies with things like the Jesus People, Promise Keepers, Billy Graham Crusades, Harvest Crusades, Expo 72. I go through this long list. But one of the things we learn is that many of these revivals are very different. One of the revivals was led by pastors and theologians, like the First Great Awakening. One was primarily a student movement, a more recent one of the Jesus People. Yet another one led by business people. You might think of that during the Layman's Prayer Revival, or even the fact that some of the most prominent people in the Second Great Awakening weren't even necessarily theologians. Charles Finney was a lawyer, for example. Some were regional. Some came from other countries. So revivals come in different shapes, in different sizes, and more importantly, some of them were pretty messy, because you had what was called in western part of New York State and central New York, the so-called burnt over area, where these revivals burned through, but because people lack sound biblical teaching, it's where we got a lot of our cults and false religions. And so I think it's going to be really important, if indeed we're in the midst of a revival, to have that. And I also happen to believe that radio might be a very significant way to fan the flame flames of revival. I think the internet might be as well. And so we might be able to be on the edge of some great opportunities. But that's why I certainly would encourage you to support not only this ministry, but if you have already supported Point of View, hope you might consider supporting the radio station that carries this program, because we want to be an instrument in that regard. If you find yourself saying, I'm not a donor, but I'd like to get that Outlook articles on revival, well, we could probably send it to you. Just leave a note saying that you would like to have that, or if we encourage you to make that phone call, just call that number at 800-347-5151. And when we send your donation receipt, we could also, of course, send you a copy of the Outlook magazine or some other resource, or maybe even send a PDF of it, or some way or another get that to you. We want to minister to you. We want to help you do the ministry that is so vital. And sometimes we are talking about issues that are occasionally addressed in the church, like revival. Sometimes we're addressing issues like this one that I held up, which deals with the whole issue of artificial intelligence. So if you believe what we are talking about is worthy of your financial support, even though we go off the air, you can still go to the website pointofview.net. And of course, you can still give us a call at 800-347-5151. As always, want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. It is our Giving Tuesday, and if you can help us reach our goal, we would greatly appreciate that. So we'd love to hear from you. 800-347-5151. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
The headlines are saying that Gen Z is leading church attendance. How exciting to see that young adults are seeking truth. Of course, there are a lot of lies competing for their attention and their hearts. The good news is you can give Americans the gift of truth. Today is Giving Tuesday, the perfect opportunity to make an intentional impact through your generosity. Every day, Point of View brings biblical truth to people across the nation and around the world. But as a listener-supported ministry, we rely on the generosity of people like you. Will you partner with Point of View here on Giving Tuesday and give the gift of truth to a seeking nation? Visit us online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Today's the day, Giving Tuesday, pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.